just after the first frost in the village of Much Dithering when the body was found. The groundskeeper at All Souls Church, old Albert Sims, had risen early to prepare for the coming Sunday service and noticed a patch of freshly disturbed earth near the back boundary of the graveyard. Odd, since no burial had taken place for weeks. The soil was uneven, poorly tamped down, and barely covered what looked to be the edges of a recent dig. Curious, Albert fetched his spade and dug no more than 12 inches before he struck something. Soft, not wood, but cloth. A bundle. And when he pulled back the edges of the stained wool blanket, a woman's pale face stared up at him, mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-breath. She wore a cardigan buttoned wrong and one shoe was missing. But what alarmed Albert most wasn't the sight of her. It was the unmistakable fact that this wasn't a proper grave. The hole was too shallow, too hastily made, and it wasn't lined or marked. It was a hiding place, not a resting place. The local police, headed by Inspector Crayford, arrived swiftly and cordoned off the graveyard. The body was carefully exhumed and transported to the coroner's office. No ID was found, but she was identified within hours by the vicar's wife as Edna Keene, a reclusive widow who lived in a cottage 2 lanes over, barely spoke to anyone, and was last seen 2 nights prior at the post office buying a single stamp. The cause of death wasn't immediately clear. No visible wounds, no signs of a struggle, and the coroner's early note simply read, "Suspicious but inconclusive." The oddities piled up quickly. There were no signs of forced entry at Edna's cottage. Her bedroom was untouched. Her coat was still hanging on its usual peg. Her fire had burned low but not out, and her purse lay on the kitchen table with cash untouched. The only thing truly out of place was her diary, open on the last page, but blank. No entry, not even a smudge of ink, and a small garden trowel missing from the back shed. By the next morning, gossip rippled through Much Dithering. Some said it was a drifter who'd done it. Others whispered of her husband's mysterious death 5 years ago. Heart attack, they said, but no one ever really believed it. She'd buried him quietly, never held a funeral, lived alone ever since. Then, just as the police began tracing any known acquaintances, a strange letter arrived at the vicarage, addressed to the one who still prays. It was postmarked 2 days before Edna's death. The letter simply read, "I am tired. Bury the past if you can. I cannot." The villagers were puzzled, but it was Miss Marple who noticed something peculiar when she visited the site of the shallow grave during her morning walk. She stood quietly for a moment, then bent down and scooped up a bit of the earth in her gloved hand. "This ground is too soft," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else, "not from rain, from haste." She glanced toward the rows of proper graves, all dug and filled by the local stonemason. This wasn't dug by anyone who knew what they were doing. A woman, perhaps, or someone in a panic. At the Keene cottage, Miss Marple asked to look around. Inspector Crayford, half exasperated and half indulgent, let her. She moved slowly, noting each detail with quiet care. On the bookshelf, a row of crime novels. On the mantelpiece, a photo of a young soldier with Edna in her youth. "Her son?" Marple asked. Crayford shrugged. "Never mentioned one. No record of family." But in the bottom drawer of the dresser, Miss Marple found a folded newspaper, clipping dated 12 years back. It told of a local farmhand, William Everley, who'd gone missing after being accused of assaulting a girl from the next village. The charges never stuck, but he vanished overnight. The article was highlighted, in blue pencil, and beside it, scribbled in the margins, was the phrase, "We never forget." The pieces were refusing to fit. A murdered woman, no clear motive, a missing trowel, a cryptic letter, and now this mysterious link to a man who disappeared over a decade ago. When Miss Marple stepped back outside, she stared again at the graveyard and asked Albert Sims a simple question. "Has any grave ever been moved here?" "Reused." The old man shook his head. "Not a one, miss. We keep records. Nothing gets covered twice." "And yet," she replied softly, "something has been unearthed, or meant to be buried again." That night, a second letter was delivered. No name, just a hand-scrawled note tucked under the church's back door. She found him. Now she's gone too. It was no longer just a murder. It was a secret tangled in time, and Miss Marple, with her quiet deductions and sharp memory, had just realized the crime wasn't new. It had been waiting just beneath the surface for someone to dig too shallow. The following morning, while Inspector Crayford sat in the vicarage poring over the timeline and shaking his head at the lack of leads, Miss Marple returned to the churchyard under the pretense of placing flowers at a friend's grave. She did so slowly, lingering by Edna Keene's shallow grave, glancing at the freshly laid earth, and then letting her eyes drift toward the path that ran along the stone wall leading to the woods. It was here, just beyond the sight line of the main gate, that she crouched down again and examined the crushed grass beneath the hedgerow. There, nearly flattened, was a narrow trail, muddy impressions with faint heel marks, leading away from the boundary. A single footprint caught her attention, not from a boot, but a smooth-soled shoe, possibly a woman's, and fresher than it ought to have been if laid 2 days ago. She did not call it out. Instead, she quietly withdrew and made her way to the back of the church, where a patch of ivy had recently been disturbed. She touched the brittle leaves, and a fine dust clung to her glove, mortar dust from the wall. Someone had climbed over, perhaps in haste, likely not wanting to be seen coming or going. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple stood once more in Edna Keene's small sitting room. She asked the constable present if anything had been taken, and he replied that nothing seemed missing except for the garden trowel and perhaps a scarf. "Scarf?" she asked. "A red wool one," he replied. "Mrs. Keene often wore it in colder weather, but it's not here now. Not in the drawer or on the peg." Miss Marple looked over at the fireplace where a tiny brass hook stuck from the wall. A thin thread of red wool was still looped around it. The scarf had been here recently. She didn't touch it. She merely noted it and then turned her gaze toward the bookshelf. A fine layer of dust had settled on the row of crime novels, except for one, which had been returned slightly out of alignment and without the same greyish coat. Miss Marple tilted her head and read the spine, buried beneath the lilacs. Inside the cover, penciled in light script, was a single line: "Forgive nothing, forget less." The house revealed little else, but Miss Marple's attention was caught when she heard raised voices outside. A young woman with short, clipped speech and red eyes was speaking sharply to Inspector Crayford. "You've no right to go spreading tales. She wasn't mad," the girl snapped. "She was just private." Miss Marple stepped out and offered the girl a gentle nod. "You knew Edna?" she asked. The girl hesitated. "I helped with errands. Now and then. Name's Ruth Densley. I brought her food, read her letters to her when her eyes were bad." The inspector interrupted, asking why she hadn't come forward earlier. "Because it wasn't supposed to be like this," Ruth muttered. "She just wanted to be left alone." Miss Marple thanked her and asked softly whether Edna had seemed troubled recently. Ruth's hands twisted the edge of her coat sleeve. She was always quiet, but these past 2 weeks she'd been waiting. She said someone would come. Someone she hadn't seen in years. She kept checking the gate. Miss Marple noticed the flicker in Ruth's eyes when she said this, a quick glance toward the woods, not the road. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Did she ever mention a man named William Everley? At this, Ruth stiffened. No, never. Heard of him. The lie hung awkwardly in the air. Ruth turned and walked quickly away, calling back that she had work at the greengrocer. Miss Marple watched her go, then returned to the churchyard and found Inspector Crayford examining the second note, the one that had been left under the back door. "It's either a red herring or the killer's got a taste for theatrics," he muttered. A confession without a name, and it doesn't help us a bit. Miss Marple asked to see the envelope. Crayford handed it over. No address, just to the one who still prays. She turned it over slowly. The stamp had been poorly affixed, and beneath it something had bled through faintly. With a small pocket mirror from her handbag, she tilted the light to reveal a trace of an earlier mark, writing that had been erased before the stamp was added. The name E. Keene could just be made out beneath. "Reused," Miss Marple murmured. "Someone took one of Edna's old letters and wrote the new message on the back." "That's not a killer confessing. It's someone covering a trail, creating a message from something that wasn't theirs to begin with." Later that afternoon, the coroner returned a provisional finding. Edna Keene had died from a massive overdose of chloral hydrate, an old-fashioned sedative difficult to detect in small doses but unmistakable when taken all at once. "She drank it in her tea, most likely," Crayford said, "or someone gave it to her disguised as medicine." The bottle was never found, but Miss Marple had begun to shape the shadow of a theory. Not fully formed, not yet. But she suspected Edna had known her killer, trusted them, perhaps even pitied them. And then there was that peculiar footprint by the wall, the out-of-place crime novel, the vanishing scarf, and a girl who'd lied when it would have been safer to tell the truth. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a letter to her nephew Raymond and, in it, included a single sentence beneath her usual pleasantries. "When a woman prepares to bury something, it is rarely the dead alone she wishes to silence." She did not post it. She folded it and placed it on her writing desk, then looked once more at the small slip of paper where she had jotted down the names of everyone Edna had spoken to in the last week. At the bottom of the list, underlined twice, was Ruth Densley. "Errands, food, letters." Miss Marple placed a hand to her cheek, thoughtful. "The trowel," she whispered. "It wasn't just for a grave. It may have been for unearthing something, or for threatening someone who feared what was already buried." And with that she reached for her coat and stepped outside, certain that someone was about to make another mistake before the night was through. By the following morning, Inspector Crayford had called for a formal round of questioning at the village hall. A handful of locals with any connection to Edna Keene were summoned, including Ruth Densley, the vicar's wife, Albert Sims, the groundskeeper, and Mr. Theodore Murch, a retired schoolteacher who often walked past Edna's cottage and claimed to have known her in better years. Miss Marple arrived early and sat quietly near the back of the room with her knitting bag, though her hands did not move. Her eyes, however, missed nothing. The first to be questioned was Ruth. She arrived alone, her hair pinned back too tightly, and her hands clutched together in her lap. "You've already asked me everything," she said, eyes darting toward the window. "I told you. I saw her last on Monday when I brought over her shopping. She seemed tired, but she was always tired. She paid me, thanked me, and that was that." Crayford asked if anyone else had been near the cottage that day. Ruth hesitated, then replied, "Not that I saw, but I wasn't watching the gate all day, was I?" Her tone sharpened. "I don't understand why I'm being treated like I did something wrong." "You're not," Crayford said carefully, "but the letter she received, the odd burial, it suggests someone knew her well, someone she trusted. Do you recall if she mentioned expecting a visitor?" "She said someone from her past might find her," Ruth replied slowly, "but she didn't seem scared, just resigned." Miss Marple, still silent in the back, tilted her head slightly as if noting the subtle shift in Ruth's words. "Resigned," she whispered to herself, "not frightened. And yet she left her scarf behind. Why would she go out in the cold at night without it?" Next was Albert Sims, who fidgeted in the chair and removed his cap. "I don't know the woman well," he said. "Hardly spoke a word to anyone, that one. I just noticed the earth was off. Too soft, too recent. That's all I saw. Crayford pressed about the graveyard's gate. Was it left unlocked? Could someone have come through? Late at night? Albert nodded. I suppose. The gate creaked something awful. I'd have heard it if I were about, but I wasn't. I was home, asleep. Crayford asked if Albert had any reason to suspect anyone in the village. Albert shook his head, but then added, well, there was a fellow came asking about her a few weeks back. Looked like he hadn't shaved in days. Asked where she lived. I didn't give him anything. Just told him to try the post office. Crayford's eyes narrowed. Did he say his name? Albert thought hard. No. But he had a northern accent. Said he knew her from a long time ago. Miss Marple made another quiet mental note. If this man had truly known Edna, then perhaps it was he who wrote the letter, or perhaps Ruth had written it, using Edna's old stationery to create a false sense of guilt and deflection. The details were tangled, but the patterns were beginning to show their seams. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Dalloway, was next. She sat with the poise of someone who had expected to be called. I knew Edna in a limited capacity, she said. She came to a few services, always alone, polite but withdrawn. I visited her once a year on the anniversary of her husband's death, just to offer comfort. She appreciated it in her own way. Crayford asked if she'd noticed anything odd recently. Only that she seemed preoccupied when I saw her last. She asked if God forgives those who bury lies with the dead. Crayford looked up. What did you say? That he forgives those who seek truth, Mrs. Dalloway answered primly, but she didn't look comforted by it. The final interview was with Theodore Murch. He was a slow speaker with a tremble in his hands and a far-off look in his eyes. Edna was in my class when I first taught in this village, he said. Bright girl, curious. Then she married young and disappeared. From view, as so many women do. Crayford asked if he'd spoken to her recently. No, but I saw her standing by the church wall a week ago, just staring into the trees. When I passed, she turned and walked away. He paused, then added with a quaver, she wasn't meant for solitude. It did something to her. When the questioning ended, the villagers dispersed slowly, casting glances at one another with suspicion barely veiled beneath civility. Miss Marple approached Crayford as he gathered his notes. Inspector, might I see the handwriting on the envelope again? He handed it over, and she examined it against a note she'd discreetly borrowed from the vicarage, Ruth's handwriting, from a thank-you letter written months earlier for a church donation. The loops on the D's and the sharp, narrow As were unmistakable. She wrote the letter, Miss Marple said simply. She used one of Edna's old envelopes, affixed a reused stamp, and posted it nearby to make it seem as though it came from someone else. Crayford's eyebrows rose. Why go to such trouble? Miss Marple handed the note back. Because Ruth is not merely a helpful girl with errands. She's Edna's granddaughter. The resemblance is faint, but unmistakable in the eyes. And she never spoke of family, did she? Because Edna had reasons to keep secrets. William Everley, the man who vanished, was not just an old scandal. He was Ruth's father. And Edna likely found proof of it recently. A letter, perhaps, or an old document buried away. That's why the trowel was missing. I suspect she meant to confront Ruth with the truth, or to bury it again. But she didn't get the chance. Crayford's expression hardened. You think Ruth killed her? I think Ruth feared what would happen if the truth came out. And when people fear scandal, they act quickly. She slipped her chloral hydrate into Edna's tea, a soft death. Then she panicked. She thought burying her would delay the discovery. But she didn't dig deep enough, and lies, Inspector, are like shallow graves. They reveal themselves sooner or later. Crayford nodded slowly. We'll question her again, and this time we'll be less polite. As he left to arrange it, Miss Marple looked out the window toward the trees. The wind had shifted. The air was sharp, and somewhere in that cold hush, she sensed the final piece of truth drawing nearer, not yet spoken, but ready. The lies were unraveling, and soon someone's voice would falter in just the wrong way. And when it did, she would be listening. The next morning brought a thin veil of mist over much dithering, blurring the church spire and wrapping the hedgerows in silence. Inspector Crayford stood at the edge of the churchyard, reading through Ruth Densley's revised statement while Miss Marple stood nearby, watching a robin hop along the stone wall. Ruth had denied any relation to Edna, but under pressure, and presented with the handwriting comparison, she'd broken down and admitted the truth. Her mother had been Edna's estranged daughter, born after Edna's brief and ill-fated marriage to a man who'd later vanished. Ruth had been sent to a home in her infancy after her mother's death and reconnected with Edna only recently, out of what she claimed was a longing to understand her bloodline. "She said she didn't want anyone knowing," Ruth had whispered, hands trembling. "She didn't want people asking questions about what happened to him. William. She said it would ruin everything." But her tears, Miss Marple thought, had felt wrong. Too neat, too rehearsed. Ruth had motive, yes, but not all the threads fit. She hadn't known Edna long. She didn't inherit anything directly, and the poison used had been an old-fashioned sedative, not easily come by for a village girl. That meant there was more than one layer to this, more than one person with something to lose. Miss Marple sat quietly at her small kitchen table that evening, a folded notepad before her and a neat cup of tea beside it. She had written down 4 names: Ruth Densley, Albert Sims, Theodore Murch, and Mrs. Dalloway. Then she added 2 more: the unknown visitor with the northern accent and Edna Keene herself, because even in death Edna had played a part in this. Secrets, once kept too long, had a way of poisoning the living. She began tracing lines. Who had spoken to whom, and when? Ruth had a reason to fear exposure, certainly. But Albert had been vague about the visitor. Why would a groundskeeper remember a stranger from weeks ago unless the encounter had left a mark? And if the stranger had gone to the post office, surely the postmistress would have said something. Yet Miss Talbot had reported no such visit. The next day, Miss Marple asked to speak again with Albert Sims. She met him by the tool shed as he was repairing a broken wheelbarrow. "Albert," she said gently, "this man you mentioned, you didn't tell the inspector he came more than once." Albert froze. "Because he didn't." "But he did," she replied kindly. "You see, you said he asked for directions. Once. But the footprint by the wall the day after the murder wasn't from village boots. It was smooth-soled, travel-worn. And the mortar dust meant someone climbed the rear wall recently. Who else would have had reason to sneak back in?" Albert's face darkened. "He came back, yes. But I didn't see him. Not proper. Just caught a glimpse, dark coat, limping. Didn't think it mattered." "It does," she said. "Because if he returned, it wasn't for Edna. She was already dead. He came looking for something." That night, Miss Marple visited Edna's cottage again. Crayford had let her have access to the coroner's full notes, and there it was in black and white, soil under Edna's nails. Not from the grave, but from her garden, likely the vegetable patch. Yet nothing had been disturbed above ground. That meant something had been hidden, and perhaps removed before the police arrived. Miss Marple crouched by the back fence with a small torch, scanning the edges of the patch. At the far end, beneath the roots of a dried-up herb cluster, she found what she suspected, a cracked tin box. It was empty, but the dust patterns and faint paper fibers told her it had held documents. The visitor had retrieved them. But what had Edna buried? The next day, Theodore Murch arrived at the village shop looking flushed. He'd had words with Ruth, though no one heard what was said. Later, Miss Marple found him at the edge of the common, smoking. "The past has a way of catching up, doesn't it?" she asked gently. He didn't look at her. "It's not what people think. I wasn't protecting anyone. I was ashamed. I taught her, Edna. I was the one who introduced her to William. He was my cousin." That made Miss Marple pause. "Your cousin?" "Yes. He came down from Manchester one summer, said he needed work. I helped him get the job on the farms. And when Edna fell for him, I told her he was steady. But he wasn't. He had a temper. Quick hands. When he was accused of hurting that girl in the next village, I knew it wasn't a lie. I told him to leave. He did, and then vanished. I thought he'd gone back north, but Edna, she said she knew he hadn't. She said she'd buried the memory, but I don't think she ever really did." Miss Marple thanked him. The web was tightening. So far, Ruth had reason to fear exposure. Albert had seen the visitor and stayed silent. Theodore had introduced Edna to a dangerous man and kept quiet for years. That left Mrs. Dalloway. Miss Marple visited the vicarage unannounced and was received, stiffly. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, "but I wondered, did Edna ever ask about forgiveness not for herself, but for another?" Mrs. Dalloway hesitated. "She spoke in riddles," she said carefully. "She mentioned a sin she hadn't committed but had witnessed. She said silence was its own kind of guilt." Miss Marple rose slowly. "And did she ever mention a woman with a limp?" Mrs. Dalloway paled slightly. "Why do you ask?" "Because the footprint left near the wall wasn't a man's," Miss Marple said. "It was narrow, arched, female. Someone with an old leg injury would have a slight drag. Edna didn't limp. Ruth doesn't. But you, I believe, had a riding accident 10 years ago. The vicar mentioned it once." Mrs. Dalloway said nothing. Her hands were clenched at her sides. "I believe Edna had evidence, papers proving what happened to William Everleigh. She didn't kill him, but she knew who did. I think she tried to protect someone, perhaps even you. But when she decided to finally unbury the truth, someone panicked." The vicar's wife turned toward the window, her breath shallow. "He was going to harm her again," she whispered. "He came back. Edna had kept something, letters, a birth certificate, proof he was alive, hiding under another name. She showed me. She wanted to go to the police. I couldn't let that happen. Not after all this time. Not with what I'd done." Miss Marple said nothing, letting the silence stretch. She knew the rest would come soon enough. Fear, guilt, silence, each had left its mark. And the deeper she stepped into the maze of motive, the more clearly she could see the shape of a truth long buried. Only one question remained. Who exactly had drawn the final line between justice and concealment, and who would be the next to break under its weight? The confession, when it came, was quiet, almost subdued. Mrs. Dalloway sat across from Inspector Crayford in the vicarage drawing-room with her hands folded and her eyes fixed firmly on a spot of threadbare carpet. She spoke plainly, admitting that she'd confronted Edna in her cottage 2 nights before the body was found. "She said she had the documents," Mrs. Dalloway muttered. "She didn't say what they were, but she threatened to take them to the police. Said she'd lived too long in silence. I begged her not to. I told her it would destroy lives. Mine, the vicar's, even Ruth's. She wouldn't listen. She said the dead deserved truth, even if the living couldn't bear it." She paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't kill her. I swear that. But I was angry. I left in tears. I don't know what happened after that." But the tone in her voice, Miss Marple noted, was strangely relieved, like a woman who had given up a burden rather than confessed to a crime. Crayford took her statement seriously. "With no concrete evidence tying her to the actual act, no fingerprints, no physical link to the chloral hydrate, and no witness placing her at the cottage the night of Edna's death, He had little more than implication and motive. Still, the narrative held together just enough to make it presentable. The public was eager for resolution, and the pressure from the chief constable above weighed heavily. The next morning, a formal statement was issued. Edna Keene's death had resulted from a domestic dispute turned fatal, with Mrs. Dalloway held for further questioning pending charges of obstruction and possible manslaughter. The village exhaled, cautiously. Curtains twitched with less anxiety, and Ruth returned to the greengrocer as if nothing had happened. The church resumed its quiet rhythm, and Albert Sims returned to his wheelbarrow with visible relief. But Miss Marple, far from reassured, felt a cold knot tightening in her chest. The timing still felt wrong. The footprint by the wall had been from someone climbing in after the death, not before. The tin box had been emptied, not merely disturbed. And the method of poisoning, chloral hydrate, remained unexplained. Mrs. Dalloway had no medical background, no access to sedatives. Someone else had administered it. She returned to Edna's cottage one final time. The police had completed their work, and the front door stood unlatched under the weight of wind. Inside, the rooms were as still as before. Miss Marple moved slowly, studying details she had previously skimmed over. On the kitchen shelf, a small glass bottle had been overlooked. Its label worn off, but its stopper slightly stained. She uncorked it and smelled faint sweetness under the musty edge of herbs. Chloral hydrate had such a smell, faint, cloying, almost syrupy. She didn't touch the inside. She simply placed it back, remembering what Ruth had said. She was tired. She always seemed tired. But Edna hadn't been taking anything of the sort before. Someone must have brought it to her. Miss Marple sat in the cottager's armchair and considered the confession. Mrs. Dalloway had motive and guilt, but not precision. She had confronted Edna, but lacked the means and opportunity to drug her. The real killer had arrived later, calm, prepared, and careful. And then she remembered something Ruth had said back at the village hall. She drank peppermint tea every night. Miss Marple rose again and opened the tea tin. Inside was a folded piece of wax paper, stained at the edge. Not tea leaves, powder. Enough to dose a cup or two. Hidden where only someone who prepared the drink regularly would think to place it. Ruth. Miss Marple returned to the village quietly. She said nothing of the bottle or the tea tin. Instead, she requested one more conversation with Ruth. They met outside the shop, and Miss Marple suggested a walk to the green. Ruth agreed, trying to sound relaxed, though her fingers were tense. "It's terrible about Mrs. Dalloway," she said as they walked. "I suppose people carry guilt for years without anyone knowing." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently, "though sometimes people are too eager to let someone else carry it for them." Ruth didn't answer. Miss Marple stopped at the bench overlooking the lane. "You know, I found the bottle, the one used to poison Edna, and the powder in her tea tin. She didn't put it there herself." Ruth's face froze. She opened her mouth but said nothing. Miss Marple continued, "You didn't mean for it to happen that way. You likely just meant to make her sleep, long enough for you to take the documents and hide the truth. But Edna was older than she seemed. Her body couldn't take the dose. You panicked, buried her hastily, and then created the note to deflect attention." Ruth's voice came out low. "She said she'd ruin everything. She was going to hand it all over. The letters, the certificate. She said people deserved to know who I was, what William had done, that I was his shame. I begged her, but she said silence was no longer an option." Her voice cracked. She'd lived in silence too long, and now it was my turn to speak. "Miss..." Marple looked at her kindly. "You had a choice, Ruth. You could have told the truth and still been forgiven. But you chose silence laced with poison. And now, I'm afraid, there's no one left to bury the past for you." That afternoon, Miss Marple brought the tea tin and the glass bottle to Inspector Crayford. He said nothing as she placed them on his desk. She told him about the powder, about Ruth's words on the green, and about the patterns that never quite aligned until now. He stared at the items for a long time before nodding. "We'll bring her in." And still, as the news spread and the case shifted again, the village murmured with confusion. 2 confessions, 2 versions of guilt, yet only 1 death. Miss Marple walked home slowly that evening beneath the darkening sky, past Edna's shuttered cottage and the churchyard that now bore her name in stone. The truth had been unearthed, but at a cost. The false victory had crumbled, and somewhere beneath the tidy hedgerows and the sound of birds settling into trees, the weight of buried years stirred in the soil once more. The village of Much Dithering began to settle again under the illusion of closure. Ruth Densley's arrest had silenced most speculation, and even Mrs. Dalloway, though spared formal charges, had withdrawn from public view, rarely seen outside the vicarage. The church services resumed with shorter attendance, and the grocer packed Ruth's remaining wages into an envelope that remained uncollected on the shelf. But Miss Marple knew there were still loose threads, and loose threads, like poorly stitched seams, had a habit of pulling wider when tugged. She had not yet written her nephew Raymond, which was unusual. Her letters always came weekly. This time she waited. Something still tugged at her, quietly but insistently, like a voice in another room that hadn't quite finished speaking. 2 days after Ruth's confession, Miss Marple revisited the village archive, a cramped upstairs room at the old schoolhouse, thick with dust and the faint scent of dried glue. She had asked for the police blotter from 12 years ago, not the one listing William Everley's disappearance, but the one from 3 months prior. And there it was, buried between reports of stolen hens and a cart accident, a complaint filed by Edna Keene. Unidentified prowler, repeated disturbances near property, believes house being watched, refused further action. No suspect named. No follow-up recorded. The handwriting on the report was familiar. It belonged to an officer named Sergeant Leo Bramley, long since retired, and now rumoured to be living just outside the village. Miss Marple arranged for tea with him that same afternoon, bringing a basket of scones under the polite pretence of checking on an old acquaintance. Bramley, a stout man with thinning hair and a shrewd gaze, welcomed her with the weary hospitality of someone who knew he'd been remembered not for friendship, but for facts. When she asked about Edna Keene's report, he grunted. She was nervous, always was, but that time she wasn't making it up. I remember thinking, this wasn't just the wind. Something had her scared stiff, kept saying, he's back, but he's not the same. I thought she meant her husband, but she wouldn't say more. Miss Marple stirred her tea. And what about William Everley? Do you remember him? Bramley nodded slowly. Disappeared overnight, didn't he? I always thought someone helped him vanish. We didn't have the tools back then to chase him down, not properly. Funny thing, though, few weeks before he went missing, I found him near the church, standing over the graveyard wall, just staring. Said he was looking for something he lost. He paused. I didn't ask what. Something about him made you not want to know. Miss Marple thanked him and walked back through the narrow lanes as the wind picked up. The image lingered. A man staring over a wall into a field of graves, speaking of something lost. The next morning, she took the long way round the churchyard and stood at the far corner where the wall curved sharply and overlooked the rear plots. One grave in particular caught her eye, not Edna's, but a smaller one, nearly obscured by ivy. The name was faint. Emily Keene, 1917–1935, Edna's sister, dead before her prime, and beside it, a stone left blank. No name, no date. Just a marker, sunken and neglected. Inside the church, she asked the vicar about the empty headstone, He looked puzzled. "It was always there," he said. "Predates my time. Some say it was meant for a child who died stillborn. Others say it was a mistake, stone carved for someone who turned out not to be dead." Miss Marple stood still. A grave intended for someone who never truly died, or someone who returned under a different name. That evening, she visited Inspector Crayford one final time. "You've closed the case," she said, "but I believe the story is still open." She placed the archive page on his desk, then a photograph, one taken at the church fete 5 years earlier, tucked into an old newsletter. "That man there," she pointed, "selling books at the charity table, that's him, William Everley." "He didn't vanish. He changed his name." Crayford leaned closer. "Are you sure?" "Quite. Look at the birthmark under his eye. Same as in the photo Edna kept on her mantelpiece. He came back, not for Edna, but for her forgiveness, and perhaps to silence her. I believe Ruth found him first. She knew who he was. Perhaps she even worked with him. But when Edna found out, everything changed. She couldn't bear to let the past fester quietly anymore." Crayford rubbed his brow. "We never identified that man. He left just after the event. No address on file. Nothing in the books." "Because he was never meant to stay," Miss Marple said. "He was watching, waiting. But Ruth knew. He had returned. Perhaps she summoned him. Perhaps he came of his own accord. But what matters is that he came, and Edna realized it, and someone panicked." That night, Inspector Crayford ordered the unmarked grave to be reopened. Beneath it, only soil. No coffin. But buried within were remnants, shreds of paper, fragments of cloth, and the charred remains of a notebook. Ruth had not only poisoned her grandmother, she had tried to destroy everything her grandmother had uncovered, every trace. But she had not counted on the past having more than one witness. By dawn, Ruth's second confession came. She had helped him return. She had believed he was reformed, that he had answers. But when Edna uncovered the truth, when she realized he had not changed, that the same violence still flickered in his temper, Ruth turned. She gave him tea laced with the sedative, but Edna drank it instead. The case did not end in a single confession, nor in one trial. It ended in layers, each peeled back slowly, until the truth lay bare and raw. William Everley was never found again. Some say he fled abroad. Others believed Ruth buried him too, somewhere deeper, somewhere properly. Miss Marple never asked. She only sat one afternoon near the edge of the churchyard, where the wind stirred the grass near the blank stone, and murmured, "The past is never gone. It simply waits for someone to dig in the wrong place." The village had quieted, but Miss Marple was far from convinced that the silence was peace. Ruth's second confession had satisfied the authorities, yet to Miss Marple's mind, too much remained unresolved. The story now had so many versions that truth had become layered, a palimpsest of deceit and panic. It was clear Ruth had tried to cover for someone else at first, then shifted blame to William Everley, only to admit later to poisoning Edna by mistake. But a mistake was too passive a word. It left out intent. It left out fear. And most of all, it left out the subtle, practiced cruelty Miss Marple had sensed beneath Ruth's manner. It was time, she thought, to test not what Ruth said, but what she didn't. 2 days after the exhumation of the unmarked grave, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the old schoolhouse again, this time requesting access to the parish's earliest post-war newsletters. The volunteer archivist, a retired clerk with poor eyesight, allowed her to comb through them alone. Miss Marple spent the better part of the morning turning fragile pages until she found what she was looking for. a list of local donations from 20 years ago. One entry stood out. Estate of Mrs. Emily Keene, to be used for future education of her niece. That niece could only be Edna's child, Ruth's mother. And yet Ruth had claimed Edna had disowned her daughter, left her to strangers. A contradiction, not glaring but faintly visible. The kind of detail only the emotionally invested bother to lie about. Returning home, Miss Marple prepared a plan. Not a confrontation, Ruth was far too guarded for that, but a test, something subtle, something unexpected. The following afternoon, she requested Inspector Crayford's assistance, not to arrest anyone but to observe. Together, they visited the cottage where Ruth was temporarily held under house watch. A plain constable waited outside. Inside, the sitting room was neat, the fire low. Ruth greeted them with a careful expression, neither warm nor hostile. Miss Marple, ever polite, took the armchair. Crayford stood. I wondered, Miss Marple began gently, if you might help us with something strange. There's been a discovery. Ruth blinked. Another one? Yes, Miss Marple said. A small one, but intriguing. We found an object buried beneath the wall at the back of the graveyard, wrapped in cloth. It's not important legally, not exactly, but it seems personal. We thought perhaps you could tell us what it means. Ruth frowned just slightly. What was it? A silver locket, Miss Marple said softly, rather dented, with an engraving on the back, for E from W, and inside a photograph of a woman. Young, pretty, a face like yours, Ruth said. Nothing for a moment, then looked away toward the fire. I don't know anything about that. Don't you? Crayford said quietly. Because the photograph looks quite a lot like your mother. Ruth's fingers curled over the edge of her skirt. Her mouth opened, perhaps to deny, perhaps to ask more, but Miss Marple interrupted softly. It's odd, though. The photograph, inside is cut from a larger one, and in the background there's another face, half visible, a man's face. We couldn't make it out, but someone clearly tried to crop him out. We're having it enhanced. Ruth's composure slipped. It was the faintest flicker, but unmistakable. Her hand went to her collar, then dropped. You can't prove who it belonged to. Miss Marple nodded kindly. Perhaps not, but it's the response that matters. You see, Ruth, most people, when confronted with a memory that doesn't belong to them, respond with confusion or distance. But you didn't ask what the woman looked like. You knew. You reacted to the name. You reacted to the man. Crayford stepped forward. The locket doesn't exist, Ruth. It was a test. A fabrication. There's no cloth, no engraving, no photograph. But now we know something you hadn't admitted. You've seen William since the fete. Ruth looked between them. Then carefully, she sat. I hadn't planned to say anything. After what happened, I thought it would be simpler to leave him out of it. I knew he had something over her, Edna. She never told me what, but she hated him, feared him. And yet when he came back, she let him into the cottage, said he needed money, said she owed it to him. Miss Marple's voice was calm. And did she give it to him? She gave him something, Ruth said dully. A packet, wrapped in brown paper. He said he'd go away. But I saw her crying that night. After he left, she sat at the window and just stared out, like she was waiting for something terrible. I thought she meant to call the police. I thought, if she did, everything would come out. Crayford asked, So you followed him? Ruth hesitated, but then nodded. He left on foot. I thought if I could get what he took, whatever she gave him, I could make sure it never reached anyone else. But when I caught up to him near the woods, he was already tearing it apart, burning it. There was nothing left but bits of paper. He laughed at me, called me his legacy. I lost control. I lost. Crayford leaned in. Did you kill him? No, she whispered. I pushed him. He fell. hit his head on the roots. I checked, he wasn't breathing, I didn't mean to, but I panicked. I dragged him deeper into the woods and buried him with the trowel. I didn't know what else to do. Then I went home and found Edna still awake. She asked where I'd been. I lied, and she must have known. The next day she told me it was over, that she'd made her decision. She didn't say it, but I knew. She meant to turn me in. Miss Marple said nothing for a long while. Then, almost softly, "So the poison wasn't an accident?" "No," Ruth replied, her voice empty now. "I gave her a full dose that night in her tea. She drank it like always, and I waited. When she collapsed, I thought I'd buried everything. But nothing stays buried in this place." Outside, the wind rustled the hedge. Crayford stepped toward the door and gave the constable a signal. Ruth sat still, her eyes on the fire, as if the flickering light could offer some escape. But it couldn't. The trick had worked. The fabricated clue had unlocked the truth not through proof, but through pressure. It had turned doubt into fracture. And from that fracture, the full shape of guilt had emerged at last. Later that evening, as Miss Marple returned home, she paused at her gate. The stars above Much Dithering were faint, pale, but persistent. She looked once more toward the lane, where it had all begun, with a shallow grave and a woman who had tried, far too late, to bury the past. By the following morning, the air in Much Dithering had shifted once again. Word of Ruth's full confession had trickled through the village, though few knew its true extent. Inspector Crayford, while grimly satisfied, remained uneasy. Miss Marple, too, felt no sense of triumph. Confessions, after all, were only the shape of guilt. What mattered most was what remained behind them. And what remained now, she feared, was someone else. Someone in the shadows, still maneuvering to ensure silence. The woods behind the church were quiet that day, save for the rustle of wind over brittle leaves and the occasional chirp of a hidden blackbird. It was in these woods, according to Ruth, that William Everleigh's body had been hastily buried. Yet when Crayford's men followed her directions and dug at the base of the gnarled tree she'd described, they found nothing. No bones, no cloth, no trace of a body. Just disturbed soil, recently turned, dry despite last night's rain. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the scene, watching silently as the constables exchanged glances. Crayford cursed under his breath. "She's lying again," he muttered. But Miss Marple was not so sure. She bent down and ran her fingers lightly over a patch of earth near the roots. "Not lying," she said quietly, "but someone's trying to erase her truth. This soil, look. These ridges weren't dug with a trowel, they were smoothed, flattened. Someone came back and took the body after Ruth told the truth." Crayford stiffened. But who would know? Only someone who— "Listened closely," she replied. "Someone who heard her confession before we did. That afternoon, Crayford had the entire area searched again. They found nothing, no tracks, no drag marks, nothing to suggest where the body had gone. It was as if William Everleigh had never returned at all. Ruth was told, and her expression turned cold with dread. "He's still punishing us," she whispered. "Even in death he won't leave me alone." Miss Marple didn't respond. She knew it wasn't William haunting Ruth. It was someone else. Someone living. Someone who had been one step ahead all along. That evening, she returned to Edna's cottage once more. It was sealed now, though Crayford had granted her quiet access. She lit the fireplace just enough to stave off the chill and sat in Edna's worn chair, letting the room speak. Every object remained in its place, but something nagged at her. She scanned the bookshelf again. The novels were still there, dusty and dull, except one, buried beneath the lilacs, slightly shifted. That was the same book Edna had marked. Miss Marple opened it, expecting to find the same penciled message, but the note was gone. The margin was clean. Too clean. The page had been replaced. She examined the spine, then the printing line. Different. Font, different edition. The original book was gone. She returned to the fireplace. A faint scent lingered, not of wood or ash, but of burnt paper. It was almost imperceptible, but to someone who had once spent weeks tending to war ration fires, it was unmistakable. She opened the grate and pulled aside the cooled ash. Within the cinders, she found it, the last curled remnants of an old book cover. The edges bore scorch marks, and though most of the lettering was lost, the word lilacs could still be read. Someone had entered after the confession and burned the original copy, replacing it with a cleaner version. And not just any someone who knew where Edna kept her secrets, someone who knew the margins mattered. Miss Marple sat still for a long time. Only a few had access to the cottage recently: Crayford's men, Ruth before her arrest, and one other person, Mrs. Dalloway. The vicar's wife had been quietly overlooked, her initial confession buried beneath Ruth's unraveling guilt. But it had never sat right with Miss Marple. The riding accident, the limp, the fear in her voice when Edna was mentioned. She had confessed to panic, not to murder. But she had also asked at the time if Edna had left anything behind. And now, someone had gone back and removed the one piece of proof Edna had chosen not to speak aloud. The following day, Miss Marple attended the morning service at All Souls. It was quiet, sparsely attended, and the vicar's sermon trembled, slightly as he spoke. Mrs. Dalloway sat beside him, composed, hands folded in white gloves. After the final hymn, Miss Marple approached her quietly, motioning for a walk around the churchyard. Mrs. Dalloway agreed, reluctant but polite. As they passed the corner near Emily Keane's grave, Miss Marple said, "You cared for Edna. I think I pitied her," Mrs. Dalloway replied. "Loneliness is a cruel thing. She wore it like a second coat." "She also protected you," Miss Marple said. "She didn't name you, even when she knew." Mrs. Dalloway stopped walking. "Knew what?" "That it was you who helped William vanish all those years ago. That you forged the birth certificate for Ruth's mother. That you told Edna to stay quiet for the sake of the parish's reputation. And now, when the truth threatens to rise, you burn the past." Mrs. Dalloway's composure cracked, only briefly, but enough. Her lips pressed tightly, her shoulders straightened. "You have no proof," she said. "Not anymore," Miss Marple agreed. "You destroyed the book. You moved the body. You cleaned the margins and made the grave just a little deeper this time. But you forgot the one thing Edna left behind: her silence. It always pointed inward, not out. She protected Ruth. She protected even you. And you, in turn, protected nothing." The silence stretched between them. Miss Marple looked down at the twin graves, one marked, one not. "The truth will settle eventually, Mrs. Dalloway. Even if the earth is stirred again and again, someone always notices when the ground doesn't lie right." Miss Marple didn't press for an arrest. There was no proof left to give. But later, that week, Mrs. Dalloway left the village quietly, her husband resigning from the pulpit, citing health concerns. And behind them they left only unanswered questions and a graveyard full of silence. Miss Marple returned to her rose garden and wrote her long-delayed letter to Raymond. She ended it simply, with a line the vicar might have used himself. "There are sins of commission and sins of omission, but it is the sins of concealment that take the longest to decay." The quiet that followed Mrs. Dalloway's departure was brittle, less like peace and more like glass, waiting to crack. The village tried to resume its routines, but Miss Marple, ever attuned to tension others overlooked, felt the strain in every exchanged glance, every too-quick nod at the post office, every averted gaze at the market. Something hadn't settled. Despite Ruth's confession, despite the uncovering of long-buried truths, The feeling lingered that someone still moved unseen, someone who didn't fear exposure, but welcomed the distraction it brought. 3 days after Mrs. Dalloway left, much dithering, Miss Talbot, the postmistress, failed to open the post office. By noon, worried villagers gathered outside, whispering. Miss Talbot had been reliable for 20 years, opening the doors precisely at 8:30 each morning. When the constable forced open her door, he found her slumped across the table. In her modest sitting room, her spectacles still perched on her nose. The tea she'd been drinking was half finished, the cup knocked over. The doctor confirmed it within the hour. Poison, not unlike Edna's. Miss Marple was summoned immediately. She arrived without comment, her gloves in her hand, her gaze flicking. Not just to the teacup, but to the envelope on the table beneath it. The ink had smudged, but the writing was still legible. It had been addressed to her. Miss Marple, I think I may have seen something. Something I shouldn't have, but I can't be sure. I'll speak to you tomorrow. No signature, no detail. But Miss Marple already knew. Miss Talbot had seen someone near Edna's cottage. Someone returning after the scene had already been closed. Someone slipping in when no one should have been there. Crayford was shaken. Why now? He muttered. The case is done. Why kill her? It isn't done, Miss Marple replied, her voice low. It's merely been redirected. Whoever took William's body burned the book and forced Mrs. Dalloway to leave. This is their way of tying the final thread. They think Miss Talbot knew too much. Perhaps she did. Or perhaps she just looked too closely. The constable reported, no signs of forced entry, nothing taken, no footprints. But Miss Marple asked to see the rubbish bin. A strange request, yet she insisted. And there, beneath layers of ordinary discards, she found it. A handkerchief. Plain, white, but soaked faintly with an oily residue and bearing a sharp, acrid scent beneath the perfume. Not the scent of tea, something bitter. Miss Marple had smelled it once in a hospital during the war, digitalis, extracted from foxglove, not chloral hydrate this time, she said. This was more practiced, more deliberate. Whoever did this wanted it to look like coincidence, a weak heart, a clumsy fall. But the handkerchief tells another story. She wasn't poisoned through her tea, she was smothered after she fell. Crayford's frustration mounted. We've no witnesses, no prints, no way to prove this wasn't natural causes unless the post-mortem comes through fast. And even then, it won't tell us who. Miss Marple stared at the fireplace. Whoever. It was new she had written to me. That means someone read her outgoing letters or had access to the mail. Crayford blinked. Someone inside the postal system? Or someone watching it? Someone who knew the village inside and out. Someone who knew Edna, knew Ruth, knew Mrs. Dalloway. Someone who hasn't left. Her voice lowered. Albert Sims. Crayford looked up sharply. The groundskeeper? He's always where no one looks, she said. He found the grave. He reported the disturbed earth. He claimed to have seen the stranger but had no name. He was present when Ruth was arrested and again when the grave was searched. But no one ever questioned him because he appeared to know so little. Crayford ordered Sims to be brought in for questioning. But when the constable arrived at the cottage behind the churchyard, the door was open and the fireplace was cold. Sims was gone. The bed was neatly made, the wardrobe empty. Only a few crumbs on the table suggested he had been there that morning. No note, no explanation, and no destination. Miss Marple stood in his now vacant room, scanning the walls. There was no photo, no personal item, no clutter of habit. Just a man who had slipped through the seams. In the wastebasket, however, was a single sheet of torn paper. She pieced it, together with trembling hands. It was a page from an old map of the village, faded at the edges, but clearly marked in pencil. 3X, 1 at Edna's cottage, 1 at the church wall, one at the graveyard's southeast corner. Crayford stood silently behind her. He planned it all. Miss Marple nodded slowly. No, he adapted to it all. He didn't start this, but he finished it. He saw the fractures and moved through them, and now he's gone again, like William before him. Crayford clenched his jaw. He's still here, somewhere. He's watching. Miss Marple, for the first time in weeks, allowed herself a moment of unease. She had followed every clue, drawn every line, but she had assumed the enemy wanted to bury the past. Now she saw clearly someone had wanted to feed off it, to keep it alive by pruning away the truth, one death at a time. That night, Miss Marple locked her doors, bolted her windows, and placed the torn map page beside her bed. Somewhere in much dithering, a man who had never confessed, never spoken, and never been seen properly was still walking narrow lanes. He hadn't left because this wasn't about escape. It was about control. And someone who watched graves never left them unattended for long. Miss Marple knew now that the final move had yet to be played. The killer hadn't been caught. He'd merely changed the board. The village had slipped into an unnatural hush after the death of Miss Talbot. The sudden vanishing of Albert Sims had unsettled even the most sceptical minds, and though the constables searched roads and outlying cottages, he was simply gone. Crayford stationed men at the parish boundaries and alerted surrounding towns, but privately he confided to Miss Marple that they were chasing smoke, and she agreed. This wasn't a man fleeing in fear. This was someone rearranging the board, ensuring the final piece moved into place exactly when and where he intended. Miss Marple stayed indoors the following day, not out of fear but reflection. She laid out everything she knew, not just facts but impressions, fragments of speech, the rhythm of behavior. Sims had always been nearby yet never involved. He had access to the graveyard, familiarity with everyone's habits, and a knowledge of timing that suggested more than mere observation. But something still felt off. She poured tea, sat by the window, and began tracing through the earlier days. Not just the key moments, but the quiet ones. And then she remembered it. A comment, something seemingly trivial. Weeks ago, during the search of Edna's cottage, she'd asked about the red scarf. It had gone missing on the night of the murder. The constable had said it wasn't on the peg, nor in the usual drawer. But later, when she spoke to Albert Sims near the garden wall, she'd noticed a red thread on the cuff of his coat. Small, frayed, almost buried in the fabric. At the time, she'd assumed he'd brushed against the scarf in the cottage. But now she realized the scarf had never been recovered, not at the scene, not at the grave, not on Edna's person. It had vanished entirely, unless it had been used. She stepped quickly to her bookshelf and pulled out a small tin box where she kept clippings and notes from the case. From a folded corner of her diary, she retrieved her sketch of the footprint near the wall, the one with the soft heel and narrow sole. It hadn't matched Ruth's shoe, nor Edna's, but now she looked again. Her pulse slowed. It didn't match a woman's at all. It was narrower, yes, but the depth was wrong, too heavy, carried weight differently, like someone used to balancing uneven ground, stepping with purpose, with the heel digging deeper than the toe. Not a woman's footprint, but a man's wearing a woman's shoe. She stared at the sketch. The print hadn't made sense because it wasn't supposed to. It had been deliberately misleading. A man with access to clothes, to discarded items from Edna's past. A man who worked in the background, who knew the ground well enough to plant false impressions. Someone like Albert Sims. She took a deep breath and moved to the telephone, requesting Crayford come immediately. When he arrived, she met him at the gate, the sketch in hand. Albert Sims never fled, she said quietly. He's still here. I believe he never left the graveyard. Crayford frowned. We've searched the grounds twice. If he's hiding, He's underground. Exactly, she replied. You remember that stone? The one with no name? Beside, Edna's sister's grave. It was meant to be for someone who never died. But what if it was used after all, not for burial, but as shelter? He was silent for a long moment. You think he's living beneath the churchyard? I think he's been using the old crypt tunnels, she said. The Keene family had a vault, sealed decades ago. But Albert would know every latch, every crack in the wall. He's been listening, watching, stepping in only when he needed to guide the events. That afternoon, Crayford assembled a team, and together they returned to the graveyard. Miss Marple led them directly to the stone. It was still weathered, blank, slightly sunken. Crayford's men began to dig, not deeply, but carefully, prying up the stone slab. Beneath it, they found what she had suspected, a concealed access panel of rotted wood, warped with time. It gave way with a soft groan, revealing a narrow stairwell leading down into the dark. The air was damp, thick with mildew. At the bottom, the passage widened into a vault not large but enough for someone to live in. A bedroll, candles, a battered tin of biscuits, and at the far wall an old cabinet. Inside were items they hadn't even known were missing. Edna's original diary, torn pages reassembled, and a red scarf neatly folded. There was also something else. Photographs, dozens of them, many taken from a distance. One of Edna in her garden, one of Miss Talbot locking the post office, one of Ruth walking to the woods, some dated as far back as 5 years. Surveillance, Crayford said, stunned. He was documenting everything. But not for evidence, Miss Marple said softly. For control. He was building a record, so that if anything threatened to emerge without him, he could steer it back. They didn't find Sims that day. But the pattern had finally emerged. This had never been about a single murder or a buried secret. It had been a campaign, a slow, deliberate manipulation of fear and silence, orchestrated by a man who'd made himself invisible by blending, imperfectly. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and opened Edna's diary. The final entry had been crossed out in pencil, then overwritten in lighter ink. They think I don't see, but I know he comes back each night. I hear the stone shift. I will not write it down. If I do, it will become true. Miss Marple closed the book slowly. Edna had known. Perhaps not the full picture, but enough to feel the trap closing. She had waited for someone to notice the pattern, and now, at last, someone had. But the game wasn't finished, not yet. The final move was coming, and the man beneath the stone would not go quietly. The vault beneath the graveyard had yielded the truth Miss Marple had long suspected but could not yet articulate, a pattern of control, manipulation, and the quiet choreography of fear, all threaded together by a man no one ever really saw. The photographs in the cabinet weren't trophies, as Crayford had first feared. They were pieces of a system, each labelled, some annotated in faint pencil. One read, Ruth, 18, enters gate at 9:17. Another, Edna, 10:22, burns envelope. It was less obsession and more surveillance, a web of observation that reached far beyond Edna's death. The red scarf, carefully folded beside the diary, was not just a clue. It was a symbol. A signature left not in haste, but in control. The search for Sims was now a manhunt. Patrols were doubled, and nearby farms were warned. But Miss Marple did not believe he had run far. The tunnels beneath the village, some used as cellars, others long sealed, offered more places to hide than the constables could hope to check. He didn't need to flee. He'd already buried himself once. That evening, Crayford came to Miss Marple's cottage, looking older than he had days before. He brought with him a letter, left in the vault, addressed in precise, upright lettering, to the one who still watches. Miss Marple read it slowly. It was written with detachment, even elegance. Sims explained nothing about the murders themselves, only the why. "They forgot me long ago," the letter began. "They thought I was simple, a boy with dirt under his nails, who dug holes and trimmed hedges and listened too well. But the graveyard taught me what people never say aloud. I saw them grieve people they hated. I watched them cry for appearances, not memory. And I kept their secrets better than they ever did." The tone was unrepentant, not defensive, not angry, cold, like someone dissecting the world from behind a pane of glass. He detailed how he had first overheard Edna and Mrs. Dalloway arguing years earlier, about William Everley, about what he had done, about what Edna had discovered and buried. But Sims never cared about William, not truly. He cared about what the knowledge allowed him to do. Power, for him, had always been passive. Not the kind one exerts with violence, but the kind one holds by simply knowing more than anyone else. "Never lifted a hand to strike," the letter continued. "Only watched and waited, and placed the pieces where they would be found. Edna was ready to break the silence, so I nudged Ruth. Ruth was ready to betray, so I let her. Dalloway burned the pages because she was weak. I didn't need to lie. They did it for me. I only needed to keep the fire lit." Miss Marple handed the letter back to Crayford. "It was never about money," she said, "or revenge. It was about being unseen. Sims wanted to be the invisible fulcrum, the one who tipped the balance without anyone noticing the hand beneath the scale." Crayford looked down at the letter. "But why kill? Why Miss Talbot?" "He didn't kill her because she threatened his secrets," Miss Marple said quietly. "He killed her because she didn't belong in the pattern. She was kind, observant. She would have seen through it. She upset the system. Sims couldn't control her, so he removed her. The pattern of deaths now made sense. Edna, the origin of the buried truth, had hesitated, so she was silenced. Ruth was groomed to be a pawn used until her fear made her dangerous. Mrs. Dalloway, shamed and broken, was cast out. Miss Talbot, too clear-eyed to miss the pieces shifting in the dark, had to go. Every act had been precise, not to gain but to maintain a delicate ecosystem of control. And then Miss Marple saw it. The piece that had always felt wrong, too convenient. The shallow grave. It had been messy, sloppy, unlike the rest of Sims's work. Why? Why leave Edna's body so easily found? "Because," she said slowly, "he wanted her found. He wanted the mystery to begin. Sims started this when he buried Edna. Not to hide her, but to stage her." Crayford's eyes widened. "You think he set it in motion deliberately?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He'd been orchestrating them for years, but he needed something bigger, something final. Edna's murder wasn't an accident or a rushed crime. It was the overture. He wanted to see how far the village would go when the truth came unwrapped." Crayford leaned forward. "So what now?" "Now," Miss Marple said, "he'll finish the story. He believes he's written it to the end. But people who write from behind shadows always leave something behind. They forget that others might still be watching too, and indeed someone had. An old groundskeeper at the next parish over had called in, reporting a man matching Sims's description passing through on foot, muddy boots, walking with a limp, asking directions to the edge of Ashwood Forest. By dawn, the constables had him surrounded. They found him not in hiding, but seated calmly in a mossy glade, polishing a pair of pruning shears with care. When they approached, he looked up and simply said, "You took longer than I thought." There was no resistance, no drama, just a man who believed the performance was already complete. And yet, later that evening, as Miss Marple returned to the cabinet in the vault and opened Edna's diary again, she noticed something else. Another note, slipped inside the cover, folded tightly. Edna's handwriting this time. If something happens to me, it won't be Ruth. It won't be the woman in the pew. It will be the man who stands too still. He waits. That is all he does. And that is what makes him dangerous. Miss Marple folded it slowly. The real motive had never been jealousy or guilt. It had been emptiness. Sims had spent years watching lives he could never have, using knowledge not to belong, but to manipulate. His crimes weren't driven by passion. They were driven by vacancy. A hollow man, building meaning from the ruins of others. And now, she thought at last, the village might begin to rest. But peace would never quite return to the corners where the ground had once been stirred. Some truths didn't stay buried. Some never had the chance. The wind carried a strange stillness through. Much dithering the evening Sims was returned to the village. Though the official story was being handled discreetly, transported quietly, held without press or spectacle, word had already spread. Shops closed early. Curtains remained drawn. It wasn't fear anymore, not exactly, but something more brittle. Shame. The kind that came from realizing someone had lived beside them for decades, invisible in plain sight, watching, manipulating, taking lives without ever raising his voice. Miss Marple sat with Crayford in the vicarage study. Outside, the constable kept a silent watch. Crayford had already reviewed the recovered materials, diary pages, the scarf, the photographs, and the letter. But despite it all, Sims had said nothing since his return. No confession, no denial. Not even a glance when questioned. He simply stared at the floor, with the stillness of a man who believed the outcome had already occurred. "He's playing the ending," Crayford said, letting silence be his final word. Miss Marple stirred her tea, watching the steam rise and disappear. "Then perhaps it's time to change the ending." Crayford looked at her. "We let him believe he still has control," she said softly. "But we give him something he doesn't expect, a version of the story he didn't write." They waited until dusk. Sims was brought to the church hall, not the station, on Miss Marple's suggestion. The setting mattered, she said. It had to be familiar, close to the graveyard, close to where it all began. The room was dim, only a single lantern lit near the old pulpit. Sims was seated in the front pew, hands unshackled, back straight. He looked not like a man awaiting judgment, but like a man who had orchestrated it. Miss Marple entered slowly. She did not sit. She moved toward the edge of the pew and looked down at him, her voice calm, her posture deliberate. "You always waited," she began, "while others acted. That was your art, wasn't it? To see what no one else saw, to let others expose themselves while you remained still." He did not look at her. "You chose Edna first," she continued, "because she was the most dangerous. Not because of what she knew, but because she began to speak. You buried her not to hide her body, but to ensure she'd be found, on your terms, so you could start the play you'd been writing for years." Still, no response, but his breath had shifted. Quieter, deeper. "You turned Ruth into a weapon," she said. "Fed her doubts, her fears. You knew she would bend if you pushed. Gently enough. Then you watched her collapse under the guilt of her own choices." She paced slowly in front of the pew. "You allowed Mrs. Dalloway to confess to something she never fully understood. You watched the police believe it, watched the village fracture into whispered blame and relief. But it wasn't enough. Miss Talbot, she noticed something, and you couldn't allow that. So you removed her too." Sims lifted his head slightly. Not much, but enough. A faint flicker of pride. The confirmation Miss Marple had waited for. She stopped walking and looked directly at him. You know what's interesting about your story, Mr. Sims. It's incomplete. It lacks the one thing every story needs: consequence. You believed that controlling the narrative meant avoiding consequence. But you forgot one detail. Something small, seemingly unimportant. He blinked once, slowly. Miss Marple held out a hand. Crayford stepped forward and placed a small glass jar in her palm. Inside was the thread, the red wool from the scarf. And beside it, a grey fibre, coarser, longer. "This," she said gently, "was caught in the cuff of your coat. Found weeks ago. We sent it to a lab in town, not because we needed to prove guilt, we already suspected it, but because we needed to know where it had been." Sims turned toward her, just barely. "It's lichen," she said, "from the southern stone near the Keen vault. Not just any lichen. It only grows in one shaded corner of the graveyard, undisturbed. For years, except for when you moved the body." Crayford stepped forward. "That, combined with the boot print by the wall, matched to your soul, places you at the scene after Edna's death. Not before, not simply as a witness." Sims didn't speak. But he exhaled, slow and measured. Miss Marple took a step closer. "You planned for every version of guilt to land elsewhere. You gave us the edges of truth so we'd stop asking about the center, but that's where you always were, wasn't it? The still man, the one no one suspects because he never interrupts." Sims finally looked up. His face was calm, but his eyes had changed, no longer distant but alert. "You think I feared being caught?" he said, his voice low, brittle. "I didn't. I was always seen, just never noticed." Miss Marple met his gaze. "You weren't invisible, Mr. Sims. You were ignored. That's not the same thing." He almost smiled. Crayford stepped in. "We'll move you now, quietly. But this time, you won't be forgotten." Sims stood without protest. As he was led away, he turned once at the threshold and glanced back. Not at Miss Marple, but at the lantern above the pulpit. Then he was gone, swallowed by the corridor's shadows. Outside, the night had deepened, and the village lay under a blanket of still air. Miss Marple stepped into the lane alone. She knew justice would come, not dramatic, not perfect, but steady, like time itself. The performance was over. The man who waited too still had made his final move, and this time, someone had been watching. It should have been over. The village of much dithering exhaled as Albert Sims was taken into custody, the shadows receding one by one. The church returned to its rhythms. Ruth, though irreparably marked by her role in the long sequence of events, was quietly moved to a care facility under police protection. The vicar resumed his Sunday sermons, with a voice a touch more subdued than before, and Miss Marple, though praised in private by Inspector Crayford and thanked with quiet handshakes by villagers too shaken to speak aloud, returned to her routines. She tended her roses. She wrote to Raymond. She walked the narrow path between the churchyard and the post office each morning with her shopping bag in tow. And yet something lingered. Not a clue, not a loose end, but a sensation. Not dread, but dissonance. 3 days after Sims's transfer to a secure facility outside the county, Miss Marple received a parcel. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, no return address. Inside, a book, the same edition of Buried Beneath the Lilacs she had seen burned in Edna Keen's fireplace. But this one was older, worn at the spine. Inside, in the margin of Chapter 7, a note in Edna's handwriting, faint but still legible. For the one who watches when the rest look away, not everything was mine to tell. Miss Marple stared at the line for a long time. It wasn't a confession. It was a signal. And suddenly, the dissonance sharpened into clarity. She rose immediately and returned to the churchyard, not to the Keen vault, nor the blank stone, but to the far north corner, near the hedge line that bordered the rectory garden. It was a quiet place, rarely visited. The stone there belonged to a woman named Sylvia Marchant, died 1943, a name Miss Marple had never paid much attention to, until she realized that Sylvia Marchant had been Edna's aunt. Aunt Sylvia had been a schoolmistress once, quiet, childless, passed away during the war, nothing suspicious, nothing tragic. But the stone was strange, slightly newer than its date. The stone mason's chisel marks didn't match the era. It had been replaced, recently. Miss Marple requested the church records the next day, and what she found wasn't a grave marker replacement, but an entire burial relocation, a quiet exhumation order signed 3 months earlier before Edna's death. Authorized by the vicar himself, she went to him directly. He didn't deny it. "She came to me," he said quietly, "not long before she died. Edna. She said there was something buried with her aunt. Something she'd placed there when she was young. Something she wasn't supposed to have." "What was it?" Miss Marple asked. The vicar looked away. "A letter, one that her father had written to someone else, not her mother." Miss Marple froze. "You mean William Everley wasn't Edna's husband?" "No," the vicar replied. "He was her half-brother." It landed with a terrible, quiet finality. "She didn't know at first," the vicar continued. "She found out when she was older, and when she realized who he really was, what he'd done, she buried the letter with Sylvia. To protect the family name, she said. But she never stopped blaming herself for introducing him to her daughter." Miss Marple sat down slowly. The original story, the entire premise, was wrong. Edna hadn't married William Everley. She had thought he was a distant cousin, perhaps, or a friend of a friend. He had stayed with the family briefly in his youth. But the truth was far more horrifying. He was her father's illegitimate son, her half-brother, which meant Ruth's mother had never been a wife at all, but a victim. And now it made sense. The silence, the guilt, Edna's obsession with burial, with forgetting, with keeping the dead buried deep. Sims had manipulated events, yes, but he wasn't the originator of the lie. He had merely exploited a truth too poisonous to speak aloud. Miss Marple returned to Crayford with the records, and they sat together in the station long after dusk. "He never knew," Crayford said finally. "Sims? He manipulated them, but he didn't know what he was standing on." "No," Miss Marple said, "but Edna did. And so did the vicar. They were trying to keep the past from swallowing the present, and in doing so, they left a space for a man like Sims to crawl in." Crayford rubbed his forehead. "And now, we leave the facts where they are," Miss Marple said. "Ruth has suffered enough. The village doesn't need another revelation. But the truth, well, the truth needs to live even in silence." And so the final piece slipped into place. The deaths had not begun with Sims. They had begun with shame, with a woman silencing one horror by burying it inside another, with a vicar helping out of mercy, and a caretaker watching long enough to find his own power in their shadows. Miss Marple never spoke of the letter again. She returned the book to her shelf, placing it between a gardening almanac and a copy of Bleak House. The note inside remained untouched. She sat in her garden the next morning, tea cooling beside her, the hedgerows bright with spring light. She thought not of Sims or Ruth or even Edna, but of the faint sound of digging, of secrets buried carefully beneath stones that didn't match the weathering, and of how, even when the surface lay smooth, the earth beneath could shift at any moment. Some mysteries, she thought, aren't solved, they're survived. The final days of April passed quietly in much dithering. The primroses bloomed along the church path, and the market square resumed its habitual rhythm. Stalls returning, voices softer than usual, but steady. The vicar led his sermons with gentler tones, as if each phrase was a thread in the village's slow stitching back to normal. But in the corners, between hedgerows, in the hollow of unused wells, and beneath the glances that lasted half a moment too long, the tension remained. Something had ended, but not quite settled. Albert Sims was remanded without incident, moved to a secure facility where he would await trial. The press never learned the full story. Crayford saw to that, as did Miss Marple, who understood that too much truth, all at once, could destroy a place more surely than lies ever could. Ruth remained at the care home under observation, no charges, pressed now that the deeper truth of her history had come to light. She had become less of a figure of suspicion and more a symbol of long-held wounds no one had dared name aloud. But even in that strange calm, Miss Marple knew something still, flickered in the dark. It came to her one evening while she was sorting through old letters in her writing bureau. A final thought, not about Sims, but about Edna, about the scarf. She'd gone over it again and again. Edna had worn it every day in winter, even inside. And yet the red scarf hadn't been found until the vault, folded, clean, untouched by soil. It had not been used to bind, conceal, or smother. No trace of violence, no residue. Only one thing was odd about it, its placement. Neatly folded, Miss Marple had said. Not discarded, not buried. As if someone had placed it aside, not stolen it. It had been a message. Not from Sims. From Edna herself. The next morning, she requested access to the vault one last time. Crayford, reluctant but trusting, obliged. They descended together beneath the churchyard, this time in full daylight. The air was damp, but no longer foreboding. The cabinet had been catalogued, the photograph secured. Yet in the corner, under a loose stone near the broken step, something caught her eye. A small metal brooch, rusted at the edge, in the shape of a robin. She held it up carefully. "It's Ruth's," Crayford said. "She wore it on her collar when she came to the cottage that week." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but Edna kept it, not as a keepsake, as evidence." Crayford frowned. "You think Ruth lied again?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I think Edna wanted someone to find it after her death, but not the police, not the authorities, me." Crayford watched her closely. "Then why didn't she leave it in the open?" "Because she didn't want to ruin Ruth. She wanted me to understand something." She paused, then turned to him, her voice slow and certain. "Ruth didn't poison Edna." Crayford stiffened. "But she confessed?" "Yes. Because Sims told her to, because he suggested it. Because he left the powder in the tea tin. But Ruth had no access to chloral hydrate. Sims did. He planted it, fed her the idea, and trusted her fear would do the rest." Crayford began to speak, then stopped. "And the brooch?" he asked. "Edna found it by the gate," Miss Marple said. "She knew Ruth had returned that night after fleeing the woods. But she also knew Ruth had not hurt her. She left the brooch hidden not to accuse, but to protect. It was proof Ruth had been there, but not responsible." Miss Marple turned and looked at the vault's far wall. "The real irony," she said quietly, "is that Edna chose silence to protect others. And Sims chose silence to control them, but both used silence as a weapon in the end." Crayford exhaled heavily. "We have enough to free Ruth completely now." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but there's something else." She walked to the cabinet and opened the lower drawer. She removed a notebook, plain, leather-bound, not yet catalogued. It wasn't Edna's. It was Sims's. The pages were filled with meticulous notes, observations, movements, conversations overheard, times, names, arguments. Many dated far earlier than anyone suspected, a decade at least. Near the middle, a passage stood out. "E.K. returns to Sylvia's stone again. Doesn't see me, leaves something beneath the roots." Could be what she took from Dalloway. We'll check when she leaves. Crayford's brow furrowed. That was when the letter was still buried, Miss Marple nodded. And look here, another note dated 2 days before Edna's death. R.D. angry. Not sure if she'll go through with it. May need to intervene. Teapot not secure. Will relocate the dose. Ensure outcome. Crayford was silent. The implication was clear. Sims had poisoned Edna directly, likely through something as simple as a biscuit or sugar cube, while allowing Ruth to believe it had been her doing. He had manipulated her guilt so precisely that she'd confessed without question, thinking it her own crime. He had arranged the perfect murder, one that left no clear villain, only shadows, and a village unable to see where each step had truly begun. They returned above ground together, neither speaking until they reached the lane. The wind was lighter, now. It moved freely between the stones, through the trees, across the rooftops. For the first time in weeks, Miss Marple felt that something had been lifted. That evening, she wrote the final entry in her journal, dated carefully. He orchestrated so much, yet not out of vengeance or madness, but a desire to be more than the invisible man. But even he, with all his watching, missed the most human truth of all. Guilt is loud, but love leaves quieter marks. Edna left them everywhere, in her diary, in the scarf, in the robin brooch. She left behind the pieces for someone to see, not to punish, but to forgive. Albert Sims never confessed. He died in his cell 3 weeks later, a sudden stroke in the early hours. No family claimed him, no ceremony followed, just a record entry and a sealed report. But Miss Marple, weeks later, placed a small robin-shaped pin at the base of Sylvia Marchant's grave. She said nothing aloud. She simply stood a moment, then turned and walked back down the narrow path, through the hedgerows, past the church, where spring had quietly, steadily begun again. The days in much dithering settled into their familiar pattern again, as if the village had stretched and slowly forgotten the tension that had once hung over its rooftops like fog. The roses bloomed in Miss Marple's garden with soft determination, and birdsong returned to the hedgerows in the morning. The church bell resumed its quiet rhythm, now somehow more solemn than before. Ruth, after a final inquest, was officially cleared of all charges and relocated with the help of a distant cousin who offered a small cottage up north. She left without a fuss, with only a brief word of thanks to Miss Marple and the smallest nod to Inspector Crayford. Crayford, for his part, remained steady but subdued. He had seen justice move slowly, then fracture, then reform under circumstances that had left him rethinking the very idea of closure. He and Miss Marple spoke less now, though not out of distance, more a quiet understanding that too many words, once spoken, can never be retrieved. The stone at Sylvia Marchant's grave remained untouched, except for the robin-shaped brooch left by Miss Marple. She never spoke of it to anyone. The brooch stayed for several days, then disappeared quietly, as if taken by the wind or claimed by the earth itself. No one saw who removed it, and perhaps that was best. One Thursday morning, Miss Marple returned from the village grocer with a small bag of currants and 2 letters tucked beneath her arm. She sat at her writing desk, preparing to answer one from her nephew Raymond. But before she began, she noticed something strange. A third envelope, not one that had come through the post, but resting atop her books, as if placed there carefully while she was out. No stamp, no address, just her name, in small, deliberate handwriting. She opened it slowly. Inside was a folded scrap of aged newspaper, yellowed and brittle. It was dated nearly 20 years earlier. The headline was short: "Child found wandering on farm road, mother missing." Beneath it, a photo, blurry, grainy, of a girl of about 3 with wide eyes and tangled hair, clutching a button-eyed doll. There was no name attached, no follow-up story, only a penciled note written on the edge of the paper: "You never found her." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. The newspaper was real. She remembered the case vaguely, a story spoken of in whispers, barely reported beyond the local sheet. The girl had been found outside the village boundaries and taken in by a foster family. The mother never turned up. At the time, it was believed she had run away or drowned in the river nearby. No suspect was ever named. It had never crossed her mind that the girl might have stayed nearby or that someone remembered her now. Miss Marple sat still for some time, the letter resting beside her teacup. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a riddle. It was something more unnerving, an unfinished thread. She rose and returned to her bureau, where she kept a small notebook of local records and old clippings. It was a habit she had never fully outgrown, even after the end of one mystery or the beginning of another. In the back pages, she found it, her original notes on Ruth Densley, scribbled when the girl first came to her attention. Born out of parish bounds, she had said. No father named. Her mother's identity, even now, remained murky at best. Miss Marple had assumed Ruth was Edna's granddaughter, as she herself had once believed. But what if that was only partially true? What if the real daughter had vanished long before Edna's protective silence had settled over the household? She stared at the note again. You never found her. The implication was chilling, not because the girl was missing, but because perhaps she was never meant to be found. Or worse, perhaps she was found by the wrong person. She folded the envelope, placed it inside her diary, and drew the curtains closed for the day. Outside, the village bustled. Children walked home from school. A dog barked in the distance. The clouds rolled overhead as if nothing unusual had ever passed through the hedges and gateposts of the quiet lanes. But the feeling in Miss Marple's chest was unmistakable. Oh, disturbance. Faint, but sure. The kind that whispered when no one else listened. She knew well enough by now that no mystery ever truly ended. Truth had a way of leaving its scent behind, subtle but stubborn. And someone, somewhere, had just stirred the ashes of a long-buried fire, not to warm their hands, but to remind her it had never been put out completely. She would wait. She always did. She would turn the pieces over gently, without haste. She would reread her notes, revisit names she hadn't considered in years, and watch, as always, when the others looked away. Somewhere nearby, a new story was beginning, and Miss Marple, ever patient, ever precise, was already listening,